unleashing female power.
Being a disruptor.
I'm always constantly telling the truth.
I love
art. That's all her life.
She's alive and female.
Being a woman, what it meant.
Prove him wrong.
Girls run the world.
We're rocking the place.
Welcome to the Art Pod. I'm your host, Carolina, and I'll be your guide through this Pandora's box. Strap yourselves in for a journey through the art world where we bring you candid conversations, untold stories, uncover industry secrets, and celebrate the women who are shaping its future. Because in the Art Pod, the spotlight is always on the girls. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Art Pod. My guest today is Noreen Khalid Ahmad. Okay. And just a little bit about Noreen. Noreen is an accomplished strategist and communication specialist, skilled at balancing the ideals of the cultural sector with the long-term mission-driven interests of every client. Noreen has a sophisticated understanding of the concerns facing public cultural organizations and private creative enterprises. Having worked with over 60 cultural and educational institutions across the Americas, Europe, Middle East, and Africa to strengthen audience engagement, fortify market positions, and increase brand awareness. Prior to joining ALMA, Noreen was the Director of Communications and Marketing at the Morgan Library and Museum, held leadership positions at Sutton, Fitz Co, and LaPlaca Cohen, as well as roles at the Whitney Museum of American Art and the School of American Ballet at Lincoln Center. She serves on the board of Independent Curators International, was the co-chair of the Young Collectors Council at the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum, and is an adjunct professor at New York University, as well as an associate professor on the HBO documentary, The Price of Everything. Welcome.
Thank you.
Okay. So I wanted to get started with your most recent position, which is you as vice president at ALMA Communications. We've obviously previously had Hannah on here, who's the founder on the podcast. And you began at ALMA this year in July. Can you tell me a little bit about what interested you in working there in the first place?
Yeah. So Hannah and I actually met a long time ago when we were working at another agency, and we always had a really good rapport. And I feel as though that's just been something that I've always paid attention to, that dynamic, like when you work really, really well with another person, because it's always worth revisiting later in your career. I have multiple colleagues and friends where I've now worked with them 2 or 3 times in different iterations. And Hannah and I developed a really strong relationship, both personally and professionally. She is my children's godmother. and we just always stayed in touch professionally, would bounce ideas off of one another, run ideas past one another. And a couple years ago, she actually just approached me as her business was really beginning to take shape about potentially joining. And it wasn't quite the right time. I had some projects I wanted to finish up at the Morgan before making a transition. But as those projects came to fruition and we revisited the conversation, it became a really nice moment where their business was at a turning point and that she really wanted to grow it. And I was really ready for, my next chapter, and everything aligned. And so we decided to take the leap together.
Nice. Were you ever scared because they always say never work with friends?
Yes. Yeah. And this is not the first time that I have worked with friends. And I think what I have learned over time is the most productive ways for working with friends. And I think a lot of it comes down to conflict resolution. And I think I've just become better and better about it over the course of my career. And I feel as though now I very much want to work with friends. I want to go to work every day and spend time with people that I really enjoy spending time with, and to not be afraid of the conflict when it happens, but to actually kind of just like take it head on and unpack it and resolve it in the most productive way possible. And that's something I think that I've learned over time. There are definitely conflicts in the past that I handled in a way that I wouldn't do so today, but that's the purpose of learning and growing.
Exactly. No, that's well said. So as vice president at ALMA, can you tell us a little bit about what your main responsibilities are?
Yeah, so I am helping out with new business development. And then my focus really has been on really diversifying the scope of work with our clients. So I have a real belief in marketing and communications really being sort of this seamless enterprise. I don't necessarily want to bifurcate the types of services that we're, helping clients out with. So I think our objective is really helping clients think about what's the message they want to put out into the world, and then thinking about all the different channels that they can use and identifying the ones that make sense for them and coming up with a holistic set of services that can help them, whether that is expressed through traditional media relations or crisis communications, email marketing, social, brand evolution, whatever it might be, but thinking about it really holistically. And I think that's where Hannah and I kind of really merge our talents and can really help clients in a really unique way, in a way that maybe some other agencies can't quite do. So, yeah.
Yeah. And what does your day-to-day look like?
Oh my goodness. It's well, so first of all, Hannah and I are both fitness junkies.
Okay.
So our days often begin with Pilates very early in the morning. Actually, I think the fact that we both are really into getting our endorphins at the start of the day is a good point of like synergy for us. And so it always starts with fitness. And then I would say our day is really structured around our engagements with our clients. Like, we really believe in having a really high touch experience. So we connect with almost all of our clients at least on a weekly basis, whether in person or via Zoom or phone. And so the points of connection with our clients kind of really structure our day. And so there's a lot of dynamism where you're going from like working on one client project to another to another. I try to structure my day so that I have these blocks of time where I'm working in a similar fashion. So, some writing blocks, some problem solving blocks, some blocks where you're really in meeting mode, because it sort of makes me more efficient versus going from like one thing to the next to the next to the next. But our days are really built around what our clients need from us and our engagements with them.
That
So
sounds like it's fun. Like, you're never just doing the same monotonous thing.
it's very true. I mean, I was in-house for 6 years at a museum, and it was so interesting because you develop a lot of skills by going very deep into understanding an organization, but there's also a lot of dynamism about working across a mix of clients and, changing things up all the time. It never gets old working at an agency, and I think there's something really exciting about that.
So what would you say is your favorite aspect of your job?
I would say I think helping clients have these like breakthrough moments or achieving a success with like a project, is really the most exciting thing possible for me. I also think it's helping them maybe get to a place where they didn't realize that they could get to on their own.
Mhm.
And I think that's where I feel really valued and special and helpful to them. So, yeah.
So on the flip side, what's the most challenging aspect of your job?
I think the most challenging thing when you are at an agency and you are on the outside is you can structure the most thoughtful, carefully crafted strategy, the most meaningful advice, and execution is only so much in your purview, and a portion of the execution always rests with the client. And I think the hardest part is producing really good work and doing your part, and then maybe seeing a client change their mind or choose not to execute. And I think that's the hardest part. And that's what it's really different. And I think it's good in the marketing communication space to try both working in-house and at an agency, because you can kind of see what is it like when you're on the inside and you handle execution soup to nuts versus when you're on the outside and maybe your role is more about giving advice or counsel. And it's different, but I think that's the hardest part, when you watch your client not follow your advice and maybe run into a problem that you could have seen coming. And, obviously you're there and you're going to help them fix it. You're going to help them solve it. But you're also like, ooh,
I told you so.
Exactly. Yeah. I think that's the hardest part. So.
Yeah.
And client breakups are hard. I think that some client engagements go on for years and years and years. And sometimes a relationship with a client, evolves and it no
Mhm.
longer makes sense to work together. And I think those moments where a client engagement either comes to an end, it's kind of bittersweet because you've finished your project and now it's time to move on, or when it no longer makes sense for an agency and a client to work together, there's always a bit of sadness, sometimes relief, but those moments of transition are also hard. So,
Yeah, I can imagine. For whatever reason, sometimes you have to go your separate ways, and it must be, like you said, bittersweet to see them go. But
Yeah.
sometimes maybe you're like, thank God.
Yes, it's a mix of both.
Yeah, exactly. Speaking of the clients that you work with, Can you tell me what are some of your favorite campaigns to kind of work on?
Yeah, I love launching new things.
Hmm.
So, whether it's a new space for a gallery, a new building for a museum, a new edition of a biennial or a triennial, I think that those are moments actually where agencies can be super helpful because, the staff of an organization is only of a particular size and it's built to respond to like the daily rhythm and workflow. But these moments where something really new is being taken on, whether it's a capital project or a really large exhibition or initiative of some sort, those are really, I think, the most exciting. I love launching something new. On the flip side, I also love fixing problems.
Okay.
I
Tell me about crisis PR.
it's actually, I think, an area that I really excel in. I
Hmm.
think that it's really exciting to help people navigate this. I think I'm a big believer in crisis communications because I think if you don't manage crises well, what happens is that the crisis or the issue just really can take over the brand of an organization and it detracts from the work of, the curators or
Yeah.
the artists. And that's ultimately why it's so important is like you want people to ultimately be focused on the art, be focused on the artist, be focused on all of the good labor and efforts that are going into making these works, telling these stories. And if people get subsumed by other things that are happening, it can be really complicated. So that's not to say that I like burying things under the rug. I think I just am more of a believer in internally handling conflict versus handling conflict through public shaming.
Amen. And we
So,
know that the art world is often littered with crises.
yeah.
So it goes to show that those that you don't even hear about, or the ones that you kind of hear about but then go away quickly, are the work of really good PR people.
Exactly, exactly. I think that most of the time, good crisis PR is not just about, keeping the story a little bit more internal, but also making sure that your client or the organization that you're working at has come up with systems and processes to make sure that that doesn't happen again.
Yeah.
So I think that's the other side of crisis communications that people sometimes don't know about is like, what is the creative problem solving that went into shifting an organizational culture or changing the way in which certain decisions are made? Because that's ultimately good crisis support that you've not only fix the current problem, but also come up with systems that will maybe prevent it from happening again. And I think that's like really where the win is. So,
Yeah. I'm glad we touched a little bit on that because I feel like crisis PR doesn't really get the shine that it deserves, honestly, sometimes. Um, Can you tell us a little bit about the what goes on behind the scenes of what it's like constructing a successful PR campaign for a project?
yeah. So I'm a big believer in two things. I like to marry good storytelling with really good data.
Okay.
And And what I mean by data is I like to be really strategic when we're putting together a campaign, thinking about like maximum outreach. Like, how are you going to get the most amount of visibility and eyeballs on a particular story? And so I like to think about campaigns really holistically. I think about social media influencers as essentially being the same as journalists.
Mhm.
Like, you want to have both of them in the room at a good moment to like engage with an exhibition. I also like to think about, what are the good stories? With every single exhibition or initiative, there's multiple angles and avenues in. And so you want to make sure that you're telling the core narrative about a project, but there will be different access points for different writers. And so making sure you kind of match make the right narratives with the right writers, I think is really important. So yeah, so for me, it's about marrying good data and good storytelling to make sure that you're reaching the maximum amount of people with a story. So
Yeah, for sure. What do you want to see happen, or would you like to achieve while you're at Alma?
mm. So against the backdrop of our current political moment,
Oh
it's
yeah.
really interesting to say that. So, we've been having a lot of conversations. So, one point of distinction, and I think a place where my values really align with Hannah, the co founder of the firm, is that I really believe a lot in art and social change going hand in hand. And there is a through line in a lot of our clients in terms of their desire for creating social change and making spaces for social change to happen via the arts. So I think that for me, especially over the next 4 years, I'm thinking a lot about how do we also work in, red states or new markets where our work might be reaching people that haven't engaged with certain narratives or stories or ideas before. So I'm hoping that in the next 4 years, we'll be able to broaden our work to some other markets that we might not have thought about before, where artists are working to really evolve and create change. So I think that the social change piece of our company's mission kind of rises to the top and is really important for me right now. So,
Yeah. Um, you guys are super ambitious. I know when I spoke to Hannah, she also had, a lot of things that she wanted to achieve and do with Alma. How do you how do you manage all of this? Because it right now you're like what, a two-woman show essentially?
well, we are growing. We have a nice team of the team is growing, and so I would say we have our leadership team in place, and we've been building out around that team. Now
Mhm.
we have a network of contractors and some other full-time staff members as well, and I think that the idea has been to grow, but to grow with real thoughtfulness and
Mhm.
care and deliberation. And I think that for us, relationships are really, really important. Our relationship is super important. Our relationships to our clients are super important. We really don't want to lose that tension, like that sense of like high touch, high care that we have. And so growing really deliberately has been very, very important to us. So, we will see, but we are growing and expanding.
Speaking of growing and expanding, can you tell us any exciting things that are coming up for Alma in 2025?
Absolutely. So, a project that we're very excited about, the Chicago Architecture Biennial,
Mm.
is celebrating its 10th anniversary. And the founding artistic director, Sarah Herda, circled back to us and brought us back in to collaborate on this edition. It's being led by the artistic director, Florencia Rodriguez. And so Hannah and I are just really excited to work with these two other powerhouse women on this edition of the Chicago Architecture Biennial. So that'll be really exciting. And that's going to be opening up in September of 2025. So we're
Nice.
very excited about that. Coming up very early in 2025, we are going to be opening up Jack Shaneman's Tribeca space with a really astounding exhibition by Nick Cave. So we're very, very excited about that. It's a phenomenal space. And we're just huge fans of Jack's program. So we're really excited about that. And then we have a number of galleries and nonprofit clients that are also celebrating major anniversaries. The National Academy of Design is celebrating their bicentennial
Oh
actually
wow.
next year. So we're excited to be working with them. And then we actually just this week kicked off some of our work with ICP, the International Center of Photography. So a really nice mix of things. But those are just some of the highlights that rise to the
Busy
surface for
ladies.
me. Yeah.
Busy ladies. I'm super excited about the Nick Cave show. I'm a huge fan of his work, so really excited.
It's going to be wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, are there any sort of clients that are like on your wish list that you want to work with or bring into Alma at some point?
Oh, so many. I actually think that's what's super exciting. I think I've been thinking a little bit more also about where art intersects with some other organizations' missions. I would love to work with Planned Parenthood in some
Oh,
capacity,
cool.
specifically around any activations that they do related to art and generating funds. So that's an organization that's always been on my wish list and that I would like to work with in some capacity. I'm also really drawn to female led and female founded institutions. And so thinking about some other ones that are out there that are female led, female founded that we might be able to collaborate with in some particular capacity. So that's like an avenue that I'm thinking about as well. And then I'm thinking a lot about, like I said, organizations that are doing really meaningful work in some red states and zones where I think the arts can really kind of help drive some sort of change and offer some perspective as well. So,
Yeah, definitely the next 4 years are going to be critical for that. So let's manifest it for you guys. Let's speak it and manifest it. Um, okay, let's backtrack a little bit to the very beginning, to your education. You have a BSc in Art History and Performance Studies from Northwestern University and an MA in Visual Arts Administration from NYU. Can you tell us a little bit about how your studies reinforced what you currently do?
Oh, absolutely. So when I arrived at Northwestern, I was a pre-med student and I very quickly tried to shift away from that. And Northwestern just has such a strong visual and performing arts program. And I decided to really make those two the anchors of my academic experience. I absolutely loved the performance studies program. I think I can still like picture certain assignments and classes like in my mind. The most profound class that I actually took was with the director Mary Zimmerman, and it was a performance art class. And our first assignment, we were only allowed to use one material, which was light. And we had to use light to tell a classic Greek myth or tragedy.
Wow.
And it was one of the hardest assignments in my entire life. And with each subsequent assignment, we were allowed to introduce one other element to tell a story, but words were the very last thing. And what was so interesting about that process was just learning how to tell a story on the stage using everything but words. And it was the most like profound experience and the most challenging class I've ever taken. And so I think for me, just being in an environment where you had teachers that were also real life practitioners really, really made a difference. And it was just a really fascinating experience. And also the proximity to Chicago made it such that we had a lot of academic year internships. And so I worked as an intern at the Art Institute of Chicago, at the MCA Chicago, at the Lyric Opera. I got to work with all these like amazing world-class institutions throughout my undergrad experience. And I think it really solidified for me that I wanted to work in the arts. And then I pivoted to New York one summer when I did an internship at the Whitney Museum of American Art. This is back when Maxwell Anderson was the director and the Whitney was still in the Breuer building. And it was such an amazing internship program. And I absolutely fell in love with New York that summer. Like I had always known I wanted to be here, but it was my first time actually living and working in the city. And as hard as it was, and as smelly as it can be in the summertime,
Amen.
I just absolutely fell in love with it. I think what I just couldn't believe was just like the scale of the arts community here and the diversity and the dynamism of it. Like there was just something every evening and like you could like make a list of everything you wanted to see every weekend and you just couldn't even get through it. And I think that's actually what I still enjoy is like you will never be able to see it all if you live here. There's just so much. And, you know, now I don't have that fear of missing out the same way I did as a young woman, but I love that it's just boundless here and there's so much and we're so lucky that we live in a city like this and I absolutely love it. So that was my turning point. When I decided to move to New York. So I moved to New York right after I graduated and actually through a friend that had been in the Whitney internship program, actually wound up at Lincoln Center working with the ballet. And the ballet has two divisions, the company and the school. And I was working with the school. And it was just a completely magical experience. Like our offices were interspersed with the students' studios and the live piano accompaniment was like floating into the office space. And, they always left out extra tickets for staff members to take. So I went to the ballet like every night that it was performing. And then along with other young people that worked at like the opera or the Philharmonic, we just had this like trading system where I would give some tickets to like someone that worked at the opera and then I would get opera tickets back from them. So I just got so spoiled for 2 years. Like I basically like was working all day and then at a performance every night for like 2 years of my life. And it was so wonderful. But then I actually returned to the Whitney. My boss for my internship brought me back and I worked there for a couple of years and really kind of it was just such an interesting experience to go from being an intern to a full-time person at the same institution. And I just really learned so much in that process of kind of coming back because, you learn a lot as an intern and then you kind of dive back in as a full-time employee at a place and you really learn just all the inner workings. And it was a really fantastic experience. So, and while I was at the Whitney, I went back to graduate school and I had just met so many other colleagues that were in the Visual Arts Administration program at NYU. So it ultimately was the only program I applied to because I felt like I saw this like nice alignment between what I was doing and what I was interested in. And I took this amazing class while I was there called Cultural Branding, which was taught by Arthur Cohen, who is the founder of a firm called LaPlaca Cohen. And he hired me out of the class to come work at his
Wow.
firm. So I worked there for 6 years afterwards. And that was like when I started my movement into the agency space. So
Okay. Are
yeah.
you originally a New York native or
Mm.
where are you from?
I grew up in the Midwest.
Oh,
Yeah.
Midwest.
Yes, I'm a
Okay.
Midwest girl.
So now it makes sense why you want to target the red states. Okay.
Well, it's just so interesting to me because I feel like even in some of these, or like red states or swing states, it's like having grown up in a place that was like that, you realize that there is such a large portion of the population that is very different in their thinking. And I think things are not as red and blue as we perceive them to be. And I think the arts are a place where the two actually meet and have some dialogue and civil discourse, which I think is missing in a lot of places. And I really want to kind of cultivate more of that in certain spaces.
Yeah, I feel
So,
like having conversations, like real conversations where people can actually debate and share their ideas in a safe space is just going out the window, honestly, more and more, which is
Yeah.
really sad. Okay, so you were in New York. You did your internship and you worked a little bit at the Whitney Museum. You were the coordinator of special events at the Whitney Museum of American Art. Then you were getting your graduate degree and you got hired, as you've mentioned, to work at LaPlaca Cohen.
yeah.
And originally, you, I believe, started as a consultant, and then a manager for strategy and branding, and then a senior strategist. You had like this progression,
Yeah.
there. Can you tell us a little bit about sort of your professional there and kind of how that took place?
Yeah. So I joined, LaPlaca Cohen had a few different divisions at the time, a strategy and branding group, design, and client services. And I started out as a strategist in the strategy and branding group, and it was an amazing experience. We were working on some of the most like profound projects of like my career. And we would handle all sorts of initiatives for clients, helping them with articulating their brand, positioning, messaging, a lot of rebranding projects, a lot of launches. So we worked on the launch of the Art of the Americas wing at the MFA Boston. We opened up Crystal Bridges
Nice.
when it first opened. And we also launched the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia when it made the move from Marion, Pennsylvania to the Parkway. And it's so interesting because I will sometimes now teach about these case studies in the class that I teach at NYU. And students are like shocked to hear about like where the brand, for example, of the Barnes was, 12 years ago relative to like where it is today. And I feel like it really underscores like the success of like what we were able to accomplish for them when we help them move and help them figure out how to successfully position that move. So a lot of our projects were these like large multi-year projects where we were working in a really invested way, helping these brands through these big moments of change or launching completely new brands. For example, the way we did with Crystal Bridges, which was still one of the most fascinating projects I've ever worked on in my career. So, and then, some of the projects we worked on were hypothetical projects that didn't come to fruition. So for example, you can Google this now, but there was once a plan to build a Guggenheim in Helsinki. And we worked on
love that.
the Guggenheim Helsinki feasibility study. And it was a really interesting process of, making the case for why a museum should not exist in a particular place. And it was a really fascinating process of like identifying the cultural opportunity and proposing it to a government and, just sort of seeing where they land. Ultimately, that project didn't come to fruition. I, in retrospect, think that was the right choice, but it was very interesting to go through the process of making the case for why something should exist. So,
Oh, that's really interesting. Why did they end up not doing it?
it was a mix of factors. There was a composite of, I would say, institutional and government leadership that commissioned the study. I think they had a particular vantage point and point of view. And I think that with some evolution in the government structure, perhaps some of those sentiments evolved and changed. There's also a lot of activity already happening in Helsinki. It's completely changed in the last decade. There's a lot more cultural institutions there. But I would say some of the shift and the changes in government sort of changed the ideologies. And I think we see this a lot in European countries. I mean, we're a little bit more immune to it in the United States, but a shift in leadership can really change a shift in cultural agenda in certain countries.
100%. Isn't that like what happened with the Pompidou, that they were supposed to open up a space in New Jersey at some point, and then they were like, no, and now they're back at it again?
Yeah, there's been a lot of back and forth because while they're going through this period of like renovation and evolution in Paris, the idea is that the collection should sort of travel.
Yeah.
And, the way in which that's being manifested and dealt with is changing.
Yeah. So as you've mentioned, you worked with a lot of prominent cultural institutions while you were there. Crystal Bridges, Barnes Foundation, the Guggenheim, Studio Museum in Harlem. Was there any particular project that you were super excited to work on while you were there?
Yeah, there are two campaigns in particular. There was a really wonderful campaign that we worked on for the Met called It's Time We Met, which was a campaign that was really designed to re-engage with New Yorkers. A lot of museums have this tendency to fall into a pattern of promoting special exhibitions because that's what drives repeat visitation and ultimately ticket sales and visitor numbers. But what happens sometimes when you are constantly promoting one exhibition after the next is people's understanding of your organizational brand can be somewhat diminished. And so I think it's really important to do institutional campaigns from time to time to remind people of who you are as an organization as a whole. And this campaign was designed kind of in this, post 9/11, post economic downturn moment of, and really designed to kind of help New Yorkers fall back in love with the Met. And it used a lot of user-generated photography, visitor-generated photography, and it was one of the most charming campaigns we have ever worked on. So I was always a big fan of the It's Time We Met campaign for the Met. And they had like a recent iteration of that. Where they were inviting New Yorkers to talk about different things at the museum that they loved. And it was such a full circle moment, actually, because they were auditioning people to participate in that campaign. And I had my children audition, and my children wound up being featured in the newest institutional campaign that the Met did. So it was a very nice full circle moment, having professionally worked on a previous iteration of this like a decade ago, and then having my kids now participate in something like this. So yeah,
so sweet.
It was.
What did they say?
They were in. I will send you a link to it. It was a video campaign, talking about. They actually they invited different people to speak about works in the collection that were particularly resonant. So, my kids have always been really big fans of the Islamic art wing at the Met, and just having this beautiful set of galleries that really like showcases works from your culture and your region, I think is so special for them. So they were really talking about how, it's a place where you can learn about your past and your parents' past and your grandparents' past. And it was a really cute little ad campaign. So,
yeah, please send me the video. I want to see it.
And then I would say the other campaign I feel really, really proud of is Crystal Bridges and the launch of Crystal Bridges. Just going back to what I was saying about like making a difference in a space or a place where, this was a museum that was being opened in a state that in a pocket of the country where there really wasn't an art museum. And we just learned so much stuff. Benton County, where it's situated, is a really unique county. And because the University of Arkansas is headquartered there, Walmart, Tyson Foods, JB Hunt Trucking, and it has a really unique quality there because the level of college education in that community is almost actually double the national average. So you actually have a population that's very ripe for engaging with arts and culture, and it's very educated. And I remember when we were going through the process of working on some initial visitor projections and statistics, we were thinking we'd get 200,000 people in the door that first year, and they got nearly 3 times that number. And I think there was such an appetite for something like that there because, you either had to drive 3 hours to Little Rock to get to a museum, or 6 hours to Dallas, or 4 hours to Kansas City to the Nelson Atkins. And so it was a really meaningful project in a place and in a pocket of the country that needed something like that. And I don't know. I think it was just very, very special. And at the time I was working on that project professionally, I was also working on my graduate thesis, and I was looking at museum buildings, projects in the Middle East, and looking at the differences between how the country of Qatar was handling their new museum projects versus how the UAE was handling things through the Tourism Development and Investment Corporation. So it was just really cool looking at these parallels between, a project in a remote pocket of the United States versus the Middle East. And a lot of the goals and objectives for how they wanted to change and interact with the populations of these places were actually the same. And I think that was like a very interesting and meaningful synergy in
That's
these two
super
separate
interesting.
places to see.
Yeah. Wow, that's what your thesis was about?
Yeah, museum building in the Middle East was the focus of my
Wow,
thesis.
very
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah.
What were some of your biggest challenges while you were there?
I think, well, there were a couple. So one of the things that's challenging is sometimes you are hired to help produce a particular result and
Yeah.
you might not be on the same page. I can speak about this now, but I did not think the Guggenheim Helsinki was a good idea. I didn't think it made sense for a wide mix of reasons. I just felt like it was not the right project for this particular place and moment in time. But it's hard when your remit is make the case for something, but then you
Right.
personally are like, I don't think this should happen. And so it's that tension sometimes between what you might believe and what you have been hired to do, and dividing your personal feelings sometimes from what you have been professionally tasked with doing can be a really interesting tension.
Oh, girl, don't
to
I
deal
know
with.
it. I feel like a lot of people go through that, especially in like communications and PR, where you're like
Yeah.
meant to stand behind something where you personally might not stand behind. And there's always, that little conflict. But obviously your job is always to work for either the client or the organization that you work with and, support them in that sense.
Yeah. And I think that's also an interesting tension that exists in crisis comms.
Mhm.
I have at many points in my career I have seen something happen that I personally very much disagree with. But then it's also my job to protect the brand of the organization where I work. And so that's where I'm like a big believer that like, okay, yes, it is your job to protect the brand of the organization, but then you also have an obligation to create the systemic change that
Yes.
won't allow for that issue to happen again. And that's actually where you can dive into where you personally might have a particular point of view and how you can help evolve an organizational culture to ensure certain things don't happen again.
Yeah, I
So-
100% agree. Okay, you were there for 5 years and then you left and then you went to work for major PR firms like Fitz Co, where you were the assistant director and as a consultant and director and consultant, and then to Sutton where you were director. What made you want to leave LaPlaca Cohen and then move on to those to those firms?
So to be honest, I probably never would have left LaPlaca Cohen because I loved our project so much, but I decided to have children and I became pregnant with twins.
Wow, twins.
So the twins were just this natural moment where I took a step back. The first, my twins were born very prematurely. And so it was just a really challenging first year of life where I wasn't in the position where I could work full time. So I worked part time. And that was when I began working as a consultant. So I was doing some consulting work for Fitz Co. I was doing some consulting work for LaPlaca Cohen. And then by the time my kids turned 1 year old, actually, I decided to go in-house at Fitz Co for a period of time. It just was the right fit at that moment in time. And I think that for me, Sarah Fitzmaurice was just a really interesting, really fascinating woman to work for. I just feel as though she is really a champion for other women in the sector and the field and really good at mentoring and supporting other women. And as a very young mom, it was really great to work for a woman who was also a mother who had been through this experience and kind of understood, certain things that, that your body is going through, that your mind is going through postpartum. And it was a really good fit for me postpartum to go and work for her. So
I'm so glad that you brought this up because I very rarely get a chance to talk about this aspect on my podcast. And this is a podcast for women. Can you talk a little bit about kind of the maternity leave and sort of pregnancy while working within the art industry?
Oh, yes. I have a lot of feelings on this. Well, first of all, I would say HR and the arts and culture space is a growing area of focus and concern for a lot of people. And I'm glad about that because I think maternity leave is really, really important and it's far too short. And it's very challenging because everyone's maternity experience is so different. And I think a lot of times we are looking at best case scenarios, not realizing that not everyone has that. A lot of people have very challenging experiences. And I think that it's really important to continue to advocate for longer leaves, more supportive leaves, more supportive experiences for women while they are pregnant, because it is very different than, when you are not pregnant. Yeah. So I am, okay. So I have so many opinions about this. One is, I think if you are thinking of starting a family, it's really important to pay attention to the organizational culture of your company and to think whether it's the right environment. And if it's not, think about whether you have the aptitude and the desire to evolve your organizational culture, or whether you might want to go to a place where the organizational culture is already just a little bit more set up for these things. I just think it's a really important, honest conversation to have with yourself, because certain places are just much more amenable to women going through this phase of life and stage of life, and others are not. And I think you have to have a really honest conversation with yourself about, do you want to be the first person at a certain gallery or company to go through this? Do you want your body and your pregnancy, to be the experiment? Some people are totally down for that. And some people have the capacity and the position within their organization to change a culture. If you do, great, go for it. If you don't, I think it's important to have that conversation with yourself about getting to a company, getting to a place that will allow you to have it all, because there are places that will do that. And it's important to recognize those. And not every place is the best place to be as a young mother. And that's okay. I feel like careers are very long, they're very expansive, and certain companies and modes of working will make more sense at certain points in your journey. And I say that, for example, because I loved working in the agency sector, loved it. And I had this moment of realization when I was working at Sutton that I really missed my kids, and I was missing their childhood because I was constantly on the road. We had so many projects in very exciting parts of the globe, and I was handling a lot of our business in Africa and in the Middle East and Latin America, and I loved it, but I was not home. And I was nearing this age where my children were starting to notice my absence. And so that actually sparked a change, and that was when I decided to, take a step back and go in-house at a museum where I was still going to be working, but I wasn't going to be traveling. And I was going to have this sense of certainty around my schedule. Museums are planning their exhibitions years out. So I could look at my schedule and I knew exactly when I was going to be busy and when I wasn't going to be busy. And I could be much more present as a mother during this particular phase of my kid's life. So that was the pathway that made sense for me. But I think it's just really important to have these honest conversations with yourself about what kind of a parent do you want to be? What are your physical needs? Because your physical needs might be different than, the next woman's. And you need to just have that honest conversation with yourself about what work environment makes sense, because there are so many places within our sector that you can work. And I think going and making decisions that are also informed by what's happening in your personal life is really important. And I think there are other moments too, like, aside from motherhood where this happens to us, you might be dealing with a health issue. Yeah. You might have a parent that's very sick. There are all these other moments where our personal lives take up more space than others. And I think being in the right types of work environments that allow us to be our best selves on the personal front is really, really important.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you. And I think there needs to be a lot more work-life balances. And I feel like the art world is so like go, that sometimes, we often have to sacrifice our personal lives with either children or family or whatever it may be to like do these jobs. Yeah. So thank you for sharing that. And also to everyone listening, go to Europe. You have 12 months of maternity leave.
I know. That is the other thing. Maternity leave is just so incredibly short in the United States.
It's ridiculous.
And it's really designed for a best case scenario. And, as you speak to more friends that have had children, you realize there are so many people that don't have a best case scenario. And so how you navigate that is really important. There's just one thing I want to say though. It's like, I just really encourage people though, is like, don't give up though.
Yeah.
I feel like I've seen like a lot of women like step too far out, especially in that first year, because that is the hardest year because, your body is healing, but you're also going through so much postpartum. And I think it's like, don't give up, but like instead, like be really deliberate about getting to the kind of company and place where you can be yourself while you are physically, emotionally, and mentally healing from childbirth. So.
Yeah, totally agree. Okay, so you touched a little bit on the fact that, you worked for these companies. There was a lot of travel, a lot of fun projects. What would you say is the biggest challenge of working for a PR firm?
I think one of the biggest challenges actually is giving everybody as much time and attention as you want to give
yeah,
them.
I can imagine.
I feel as though I have a tendency to fall in love with like all my clients, and I feel this like push pull every day of like, oh, I also want to do this for somebody. I also want to do this for somebody. And it's about balancing your time and your efforts. You will never be able to do everything for everybody. And so giving everything your best shot, your honest shot, I think is really important. But you'll always have that like idea that or something else you want to do. And I think that's the hardest part is like, I always find myself wanting to do a little bit more. So like sticking to your scope of work and like being really, focused in how you are delivering the best work product. But I think that's the hardest part for me is I always want to do a little bit more for somebody than I was able to do. And I always want to go that extra mile. So that's the hardest part for me. I also think, one of the hardest parts is, kind of balancing is the work-life balance piece. In the agency world, you have to be very available to your clients. And I think as a function of that, you are working on weekends, you are working evenings, you are working mornings. And I think figuring out how you do that in a way where you also still feel like you're getting your downtime is really important. So I have found for myself, for me, it's like I have these like little pockets of the day where I just put my phone on do not disturb, and it won't be a long time, but it'll be like an hour or two, and I just put it away so I can just like write or get caught up on something, or like go get a massage, go get my nails done, go do something for myself, go to Pilates. I used to be that person where I always brought my phone into the Pilates studio. I stopped doing that recently. Mm-hmm. And so just creating these like breaks for yourself within your day, knowing that you are chronically going to be connected. So it's your job to decide how you're going to create that balance. But I think that constant connectivity can be very hard sometimes, and you have to build in moments of rest for yourself throughout the day.
I think people really need to understand that self-care is critical because you need to be at 100% at your job, mentally, physically, to give them 100% of like your best effort.
Yeah. And I think the reality is like, you can't always refill your tank by going on a vacation.
Yeah.
Like it might be months until you get your next like, vacation sometimes. So you have to create smaller moments of rest in your day and your week so that you don't burn yourself out. And I think that's probably the hardest part.
100%. So you decided to leave the PR firm life behind for a little bit, and you went on to be the director of communications and marketing at the Morgan Library and Museum.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about first how you got the job there?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, funny enough, the Morgan had been a client at LaPlaca Cohen.
Okay.
So that was actually another really great full circle moment. And that's what I was saying too. I was like, there are these moments where like you circle back to people, circle back to organizations. So there is a really, I really believe a lot in the power of mentors and mentorship. And I mentioned Sarah Fitzmaurice, I think, is a woman in the field who's just been really generous with her time and her mentorship of younger women. I had the good fortune of meeting Kim Mitchell, who now is a partner at Brunswick, who was the longtime head of marketing and communications at the Museum of Modern Art. And Kim is one of those people where every 12 months or so, we grab a coffee, we have a drink, and, I will just kind of tell her a little bit about what is going on, what I'm thinking. And Kim is one of those people where she just provides the greatest counsel. And I had seen this position posted at the Morgan, and to be honest, I did not see myself as someone that would work at the Morgan. I thought I was maybe too politically progressive, too cutting edge. And Kim actually encouraged me. She was like, I actually think that they need someone like you. They have these ambitions to grow and evolve their audience, and they actually need someone like you in this role to achieve what they want to achieve. And so at Kim's introduction, I went in to go meet with the deputy director, Jessica Ludwig, and the director, and actually had these really great conversations. And Jessica had come to the Morgan after working at the Clark and the Guggenheim, and was really one of these people that was really, an agent of change at the Morgan. And it was really exciting to work under her for this last 6 years and really kind of help evolve the audience. I mean, we really were able to grow it. We were able to diversify it. We were able to come back to our pre-pandemic attendance numbers after the pandemic. So it was really nice to be an agent of change in a very traditionally perceived institution. And, it was a very exciting time to be there. So, yeah.
Okay, nice. So can you tell us a little bit about the switch from working for firms for so long to an art institutions? Obviously was much more different, and you touched a little bit on the fact that you started traveling less, but can you tell us a little bit more about, obviously when you're at a firm you have many clients that you attend to, and this is this is your one client, so you get to know it very intimately. Can you tell us a little bit about that switch?
So the interesting thing is, at a place like the Morgan, and I think you probably experience this at some larger institutions too, the curators that are putting together individual exhibitions sort of become your new clients. And so I felt like I had a very similar structure. It was just, instead of different organizations, I had different curators who I was now collaborating with to tell the most meaningful stories about exhibitions. I think for me, what was very exciting was coming into an institution that really was interested in making changes. And so then figuring out what expression of change made sense for that institution was the challenge. So when I first started at the Morgan, I actually did a brand audit the same way I would do when I was hired by a client. And I went on like a listening tour. I sat down with different department heads that were in positions where they were interfacing with the general public in some capacity, just to hear about like where they thought the institution's brand was, what was working for them, what wasn't working for them. And I did that in tandem with our first audience research study. We hadn't done audience research in like 6 years. And I'm a big believer, as I was saying earlier, about like marrying good data and good storytelling.
100%.
Because if you don't have the data and you don't know who you're talking to, like you don't know if you're putting the right story in front of the right audience. So it was actually very exciting, because what our data showed us was that we were kind of naturally already evolving our audience. And if we were just a little bit more strategic in certain areas, we would go even further. So the composite of doing that audience research with that internal brand audit kind of gave me some areas of focus. We decided to really evolve our email marketing strategy, because 85% of our audience actually said that was one of the most important tools and pieces of information. And I think in the age of social media algorithms, when you've opted in to receive emails from an organization, you actually do want to receive them and want to open them up and look at them. And it's very different than how we engage with social media. So we decided to evolve our social media, evolve our email marketing. We decided to really invest in our social media. We had a very, I would say, passive approach to social media. We decided to become very editorialized with it and integrated video for the first time. And then the last area of focus for me was also on diversifying how we were advertising. We were sort of spending like 75% of our budget on print and 25% on digital. We just like flipped it around. And so this was like my little roadmap that we made. And we were on our way with, creating video content and editorializing social and redoing all of our email marketing and, moving into digital advertising when the pandemic hit. And then all of a sudden, like every museum, it's like, oh, we're no longer a museum. We're now a media company.
Yeah, literally.
And for 6 months, it was actually great that we had all this new video content, like kind of in our, in our bank, and we just started releasing it and sharing it. But it was actually a really great moment, because I think it just moved us forward in thinking about our audiences online and on site at the same time, because they're both so, so important. Ultimately, we were engaging with 7 million people a year online through social and web. and getting about 300, a quarter million to 300,000 on site. And so, they both matter a lot. And if you don't stay top of mind for these visitors and other places and spaces when they come to New York, they're not going to become that in-person visitor. So it was a really exciting time. And it was really nice to just kind of be given space to experiment, space to launch a video program, launch an audience research protocol, space to become digital, versus print based in a lot of our advertising. And, there was also a lot of diversity, equity, access, and inclusion work happening. And it was very challenging and rewarding to be a part of that work at the Morgan, because I think we handled a lot of things with great care and authenticity. And I was really excited about some of the things that came out of that. Right now, actually on view at the Morgan is an exhibition that I hope everyone will go see. It's about Belle DaCosta Green, who was actually the Morgan's first director, and Pierpont Morgan's personal librarian. And she was actually a woman of color, but she chose to live her life as passing because she came into this position in the early 1900s when, there were very few women of leadership in cultural institutions, let alone women of color. And she just has a fascinating story. And I think over time, she had been kind of diminished in the institution's history and story, and working with a group of cross-departmental colleagues to bring her back up and create this exhibition. My team specifically worked on a really great 4-part video series that you can watch online about her story. Those videos are all being shown on site in the museum and the galleries now. Was really, really exciting. So, being able to do that diversity, equity, access, and inclusion work, though, in ways that were very authentic and connected also to our exhibition program was super meaningful to me. And for the Morgan, that expressed itself in some really unique ways. So obviously it was elevating Belle, but even in some of our more historic exhibitions, thinking about alternative narratives or elevating female voices and other perspectives. One of my favorite exhibitions that I worked on at the Morgan was actually related to the oldest part of our collection, which is 6,000 years old. And it was the ancient Asian Western seals and tablets collection. And we did a fascinating exhibition on Enhetuana, who's actually the world's first named author. So it's actually kind of fascinating to me that the oldest piece of poetry that we know that is attributed to an author is actually from a woman. This is not something that we learn in school. She was a priestess and a princess of noble birth. And our curator for this area of the collection put together a fascinating exhibition, just really looking at the rise of women in ancient Mesopotamia through her as an anchor in this story. And it was one of the most fascinating exhibitions I have ever worked on. So, I think that's an expression of diversity work too. It's revisiting how we have told our history and thinking about other perspectives, because of course women existed then too.
Yes.
And their stories haven't necessarily been told. And so I really enjoyed how we really thought about what was the authentic expression of DEI work for an institution like the Morgan, and working on exhibitions like Belle DaCosta Green and Enhetuana was, I think, really an enriching and I think, thought-provoking time period for me in my career. So
wow, now I need to look into this because this woman, I've never heard of her.
I will take you. It's a great show.
Yes, I have.
I'm putting together tours for some of my friends
and
colleagues. So
yes, I'm totally down. Let's do it. Speaking of, all these incredible shows and things that you were doing at the Morgan, on the flip side, what would you say was one of your biggest challenges while being there?
Yeah, so I think what's very hard when you are hired as an agent of change or a change maker at an institution, so the Morgan just turned 100, is the fact that it is 100 years old. So obviously, the way in which they have been doing things does work. You don't make it to 100 years because you've been doing it incorrectly. You make it to 100 years because there's a lot that you have been doing correctly. And so I think when you are hired as a change maker, working very carefully with colleagues on what to evolve versus what to keep is really critical. And I think that for some departments and some colleagues, where I was proposing change was not where they wanted to see change. And so I was able to create change, in some departments to a greater degree versus others. And it's just because everyone's perspective on this is different, and you have to respect people's opinions and meet people where they are. Not everyone is going to want to do Instagram lives with you.
Oh yeah.
Not everyone wants to film video content, and that's okay. But then you, as the marketing communications professional, have to think about, well, how can you still move the dialogue forward, even if the curator in a particular area isn't ready for what you're proposing? And that can be challenging, that can be frustrating, but change happens incrementally at a lot of these types of institutions. And I think identifying where you can make it and pushing things as far as you can where you can make it is really the answer. So.
Yeah, I think there come points in any institution's history, especially traditional institutions, where you really have to either start thinking about changes or you will not make it.
Yeah.
Like, I understand, like these institutions are like 100, 150 years old, whatever it may be. But at some point that becomes no longer relevant, and you really need to start embracing change in order to, sustain the institution.
Yeah. We went through a really interesting strategic planning process, but also just when I was doing our brand audit at the Morgan, like trying to pick apart what's our through line. And what we kind of settled on, which was super interesting, was just that we are about illuminating the creative process from 4000 BC to the present. And so thinking about that and always coming back to that idea of, how does this exhibition, how does this video content series, how does this Instagram series resonate with that idea of illuminating the creative process, was a really great touchstone. So I think it's really important. So it's picking out what that is and then modernizing it and making it relevant to contemporary audiences, I think is just super important.
Yeah. And then you mentioned, earlier on, that you left the Morgan to go work with ALMA.
Yeah.
Was it hard for you to say goodbye?
I think the hardest part for me was that the timing of the switch meant that I wasn't going to be at the Morgan when the Belle de Costa Green exhibition opened. However, I had been working on different parts of it for many, many years. And I think that's actually one of the bittersweet things about change, is that sometimes the moment to make a change doesn't totally line up with a project that you wanted to see to fruition or a thing that you wanted to do. And when, there are certain seasons of change that make more sense with motherhood and your children's schedule and other things, and you've got to balance it all. So I chose, and one thing that I will say that I think other mothers that are working can relate to is there are changes and times of the year where you can accommodate more change, and summertime is an easier time when your kids are away at camp to redecorate and reshuffle and to make a transition to a new job. And so I really wanted to dive deep and put in a lot of effort and, go deep while my kids were away. So that I had this period where I could really focus. They were away at camp and I could get going on this new job and be settled in it by the time they returned and were ready to start their next year of middle school. So, change doesn't always come at the exact moment that we want it to, but, you got to balance it all. What works personally, what works professionally. But I love the Belle de Costa Green show at the Morgan. I've been to see it so many times. And I think that's actually one of the nice things to remember is we're so fortunate in this sector where, you can still engage with a former employer or a former client by going to see their exhibitions. And I think we're so fortunate in that way. You never really lose touch with the places you've worked at a lot of the time, because for us, so many of the places where we work, the work product is so public that you can always go visit it, always go see it. And I think we're so lucky in that regard.
Yeah, it's so crazy that you mentioned that, because last week I was at the opening for the Maria Lai show at Magazino, and I worked at Magazino for 8 years. And it was one of those shows that I was hoping to work on before I left, but didn't get a chance to. And then my former colleagues, some of whom are still there, were like, how does it feel? Because I left in May and now I came back and it was November, so it's been some time. And I was like, weirdly, it felt like no time has passed at all. I was just there yesterday.
Yeah, it's funny. It's when I go to the Morgan now as a visitor, it still feels like home.
Yeah.
And I feel that way about some clients that are long-term projects, at the Guggenheim, for example, they were a client when I was at LaPlaca Cohen, and I chaired the Young Collectors Council at the Guggenheim for a decade. And when I walk in, there's this one security guard who's often at the front door that still asks me how are the twins? And I love those points of connection. And I think that's just something to remember is different institutions are going to kind of come and go from your life in different ways. You know, you'll be a visitor at moments in time.
Yeah.
You'll be an employee. You might be involved philanthropically at other moments in time, but there are all these different ways that we get to be involved. And I think we're so great. I'm so grateful for that.
Me
So.
too. All these jobs that you've had, you were super busy, and you still also found time to be an educator. You've served as a faculty member for online learning at the Sotheby's Institute of Art in New York, teaching courses like arts marketing and communication, social media, and marketing for the art world, principles of art business for 7 years. And you're also currently still teaching at NYU. You've been an adjunct professor at NYU in the Visual Arts Administration program, in the Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development, teaching cultural branding and being a guest lecturer in the Museum Studies program in the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, teaching museum management. What made you want to teach?
I absolutely loved the Visual Arts Administration program at NYU. I have so many friends and colleagues from that program all over the field. And I think what I really enjoyed about my graduate education was its practicality. Undergrad is very theoretical, and it's very good to like think about the world in that perspective and understand it. But my visual arts administration program, I felt like I made so many connections. I got hired out of that program, and that cultural branding class that I took because I went to go work at LaPlaca Cohen. I became Arthur Cohen's TA for the class. So I TA'd the class a couple times while I was working at LaPlaca Cohen, and he was teaching it. And then when he retired from teaching, the head of the program actually called me and was like, well, how do you feel about teaching it? You know the class from the perspective of a student. You've TA'd it. You're working in this industry. And I thought it was like a joke at first. I was like, you want me to teach? And then I realized, I was like, oh, wait, I've been doing this sort of work for a minute. I'm kind of an expert in this now, I think. And so it was really exciting. And what I like about it now, as what I would describe as like a mid-career professional, is it's such a fascinating way to connect with a younger generation and to understand how people in their 20s process information, how they think about the world, how they view arts and culture. And I think it's so important ultimately as a marketing and communications professional to understand the vantage points of people in different generations, because every single generation is important to like your audience hierarchy and framework. You have to constantly be getting new people in the door, engaging with people when they're going through moments of like, extreme change in their life and starting their families and feel like they don't have time, like making the case for arts and culture, and then, staying engaged with them as they grow older. So I really like how teaching has kept me connected to a younger generation, and being able to tell them stories about, past projects and how things have evolved. I mean, sometimes now I almost feel like I'm teaching things that are a bit historical, but like, talking about the launch of Crystal Bridges, which is now just like a very well-known institution, or, talking about, certain places and museums and institutions like the MFA Boston, where people don't even remember what it was like before the Art of the Americas wing. And I think teaching about these projects is really, really helpful. And I like to do that against teaching, against the backdrop of like a gallery that I might be working with like right now in the moment. And I think it's just really helpful context for students. So I really love it as a way to connect with young people and to understand their point of view, because it's different than mine.
Yeah, 100%. So what are some of the biggest lessons you want your students to take away from you?
I think the biggest one is that everything is cyclical. I think that's really important to remember against the backdrop of our current political moment. When I graduated from college, or when I was in college, Bush versus Gore had happened. And I remember feeling a sense of hopelessness, which was replaced with optimism. And then 9/11 happened. And then, a few years later, the big economic downturn happened. And so there are just these cycles and these moments of contraction in the market. And I think that it's just really important to remember that things are cyclical, and some of the ways in which you can really insulate yourself against the downturns and these cycles is about keeping your skill set really relevant and sharp and fresh, and like never stop learning, never stop wanting to take on new skills, because that's how you can kind of weatherproof yourself, if you will, against these moments of change. So
So now moving on, I also want to cover the fact that you have also been a board member for Independent Curators International, going now almost on 12 years.
Mhm.
And you were also the chair of the Young Collectors Council at the Guggenheim for 11 years.
Mhm.
Can you tell us a little bit about what these positions entailed and what attracted you to these institutions?
Yeah. I can start with the Guggenheim actually. So I was the co-chair of the Young Collectors Council for 11 years.
Mhm.
I'm no longer young, so I'm no longer in that role. I basically held that position until I took a job at the Morgan, and then there was a conflict of interest with being on staff
Yeah.
at a museum. And co-chairing this committee. But what drew me to the committee actually was a colleague of mine in graduate school, Helen Warwick, who I now co-teach a class with in the Museum Studies program at NYU. See what I mean by like everybody comes back around?
Yep.
Helen was the head of individual giving at the time and mentioned the committee and thought I would be really interested in it. And I was, and I joined it and then moved into a leadership role. The thing that I absolutely loved about the Young Collectors Council was the acquisition committee meetings. We were actively contributing to the collection. And in the 11 years I was involved, we brought dozens of new works into the collection. The committee has brought in, I think, over 100 works over the course of its time. And, we've actually really helped to shape the collection. And so I think the actual process of acquisition was really exciting to be a part of. And then, the process of like learning about those artists, because our entire program was kind of built around studio visits with these artists, conversations with these artists, et cetera. So that to me was really the most exciting part. And then as a member of the leadership team, we also got to engage with other donor groups at the museum and participate. And I took some of the most life-changing trips of my entire, existence on this planet with the Guggenheim. I had the pleasure of going to China with Alexandra Monroe, which was amazing. And I had the chance to also go to South Africa with Wendy Fisher at the time that she was the board chair there. And it was just such a fascinating way to engage with the arts and culture of a country via its art through one of these like really amazing travel programs. So I always will have a soft space in my heart for the Guggenheim. Like I said, I still love going there. I walk in the door there, still, and the guards still ask me how the twins are. And I still feel at home there whenever I go there. So it's really special. So that's the Guggenheim. With Independent Curators International, funny enough, it's another graduate school connection. I was taking a class in the Museum Studies program with Bruce Altschuler, who used to run the program. He has since retired. And Kate Fowle, who was the director of ICI at the time, was a guest lecturer there. She's also worked at UCCA and also launched Garage in Moscow and was the director at MoMA PS1 for a while. She's currently at Hauser and Wirth now. So Kate has had this really involved career where she has launched many nonprofit spaces and now is working in the commercial art world. And Kate was like, I think you would really like what our organization is doing. And I really did. And I think what I really love about ICI is that its mission is just so unique. So this idea, so there's sort of two really important strains of work for the organization. We work on training up curatorial talent, specifically in markets and places where there aren't necessarily academic programs. So that's one area. And then the other is matching up curators with institutions to show their independent projects. So each year we'll take a certain number of exhibitions under our wing and help kind of augment them and tour them around the country and around the world. And I just love the mission of what we do, and the connections that we make across curatorial talent around the globe. And yeah, I've now been involved for 12 years. And similarly, I think, in that time, seen so many curators launch these really amazing projects, heard about a project when it was just an idea and now it's completely manifested and touring. And, also I've had the chance to travel to some really amazing places with our board of trustees. I think one of the most exciting trips that we took actually was to Russia. We went to Moscow and St. Petersburg when Kate Fowle was launching Garage. And, I'm really glad I went when I did because I don't know that I'll have an opportunity to go back. And, I think it's just a reminder too that, travel is just very, very important. The world is changing very quickly. And, if you have a chance to see a particular place in a space, go see it.
Yeah, St. Petersburg has been on my bucket list for so long, and I'm so upset that I haven't gone when I had the chance because now it's a very different time.
Yeah.
But still hoping to go one day. Okay, great. And then before we head into our final questions, I also wanted to ask you, because you were also the associate producer on the HBO documentary, The Price of Everything.
Yes.
Which is really cool. For those who might not be familiar with The Price of Everything, can you tell us a little bit about what it is?
Yeah, so it's a documentary that through a series of interviews with artists and other individuals that work in the art market, kind of questions and picks apart the idea of how works are valued and priced. And it's so beautifully done. I'm such a big fan of it. And I got involved in the project kind of in an interesting way, actually, because of a Guggenheim travel program to the one trip we took to South Africa. I met the head producers on that particular trip, and they invited me to become an associate producer on the project. So I got to participate that way, made a financial investment, also helped make some connections and introductions that led to some of the final products and moments in the film. And it was such a successful project. I'm happy to say that I am one of the few people on this planet that can say that she made money off of an art documentary, because we had the good fortune of selling it to HBO. And we all actually, not only walked away with this incredible learning experience, but also made a little bit of money.
Get it. All right.
So, and I think what I really enjoyed about this and what I think is interesting is it's something that has kind of demystified a little bit of the art market, which is so opaque to a more broad and general audience. And I hope it's something that we continue to do. I think it's one of the most opaque marketplaces.
Yes.
And I think that any insights that we can give to people are really important. But I also think that what I think I learned the most in this process was just also, for me as an individual, how much I think I have divorced value from price of art on a personal level.
Same.
I mean, I have a lot of artwork that I still own that I will never part with, even if it's worth a lot, because it means a lot to me. And then I have some artwork that I think has probably lost a tremendous amount of value, but it still hangs in my home in a pride of place because it has value to me. And that's ultimately the most important thing. And that is ultimately the reason I would have a work of art in my home. So
I think regular people who don't work in the art industry are often really mystified about how these prices come about, because they see obviously work selling at a gallery for a certain amount. Then they see these works go to auction and fetch millions of dollars, and just what's worth what and why is it worth that? So I think it's the documentary was really interesting.
Yeah, and I actually think right now, because the art market is in such a strange moment, it's very interesting to revisit it. It's only a few years old, but it is pre-pandemic. But I think it's good to revisit because we have a lot of artists right now who are struggling with this dip in the value of their work. And I think everyone's like, oh, is this the end? And I'm like, it's never the end. It's a moment in time. And it often looks like another moment in time that you might have seen not so long ago. And it's good to revisit these things so that we understand again, how they are cyclical, and, just how prices do ebb and flow. But ultimately, I think a lot of people, I struggle with the idea of art as an investment. For me, art is a passion.
Same.
And I think that the value of it is a side effect or a side thing. And it's, it's lovely if something goes up in value, but ultimately, that's not why you do it or create it or are involved with it. So
hence why I never ended up being in sales or working at an auction house, because that was just never my MO for being around art.
And I think for me too, because I have this dual visual and performing arts background. And I think for me, because I am so invested also in performance, actually the exhibition that Hannah and I have been working on, helping promote this fall, that has been the most exciting exhibition, is the Alvin Ailey show, Edges of Ailey at the Whitney. Show. And I think it's so fascinating that it's being presented at the Whitney. I also think that it sort of speaks to, I think, art forms that have an ephemerality and how much value they can have, even if it's not necessarily fiscal or financial value, because they have the ability to create change and emotional impact. And so I think that there's a lot of art forms that just don't necessarily have conventional market value, but are still some of the most important things that I've ever seen or participated in. And it's actually one of the most important acquisitions that we made while I was at the Guggenheim was Gerard and Kelly's piece Timelining. And I actually think it was so fascinating to bring performance work into the collection of the museum. I had seen it originally performed at the kitchen. And, what does it mean to acquire a performance? Like, what is the cost of it? How do you restage it? These were all just such fascinating things for us as a committee to be educated on and to learn about. But I wound up actually acquiring a piece at that time. There's a sculptural piece that was connected to timelining that Gerard and Kelly made, and I still have it and it hangs in my home. It's one of my favorite pieces. But it's interesting because ultimately, that physical sculpture that I have is a pathway to me remembering the actual sentiment of the in-person performance.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of really valuable pieces of artwork out there that are very hard to wrap your hands around and really hard to value, that have
100%.
extreme emotional value. So
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about what it entails to be an associate producer on the documentary?
Oh yeah. So I think I think anytime you're investing in a film project, you can be involved either just monetarily and just make a fiscal investment, or you can be involved through effort as well. And so in this case, it was a little bit of a hybrid. So I made a financial investment in the film. I also was supportive in marketing and promotional efforts, just because I was one of along with a friend of mine, Ann Huntington, we were some of the younger associate producers on the film in terms of bringing it to new audiences and introducing it to younger audiences. And then also just kind of providing feedback to the lead producers while they were giving shape to the project. So I remember getting like early prospectus on it, providing feedback, making suggestions of artists we could interview, people we could connect with, things of that nature. So that was the nature of my involvement. And then I think you can really shape your involvement. And I think that then there are some producers that will obviously have just a very different type of role where they're actually helping in the creation of the film. And so production and support takes a lot of different films. I think for me, what was so interesting was like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize how many people it takes to make a documentary.
Yeah.
a lot. And I have all sorts of friends that are filmmakers, but I really have like a whole new found appreciation for their craft after being involved in one. I've since retired from my film career. That's a one and done. Maybe I'll be involved again in the future in some way. But it was a very exciting project to be a part of. So
yeah, no, it's super fun, and thank you for sharing your experience with that. My last two questions before we go into the fire round of questions. The first one that I ask all my guests is, have you faced any specific challenges as a woman working in the field?
Yeah, I think I think my maternity time was the hardest time. I found being pregnant and trying to keep up with my work was so hard. I can totally say this now because like this is very funny to me, but like I remember like just feeling so tired. Like I would go to the bathroom and I would just like sit down in the corner of the bathroom and then like realize I'd fallen asleep for like a half an hour. Like put my head down at my desk and like actually have fallen asleep. So I think that pregnancy and work and that first year, especially postpartum, are some of the hardest years that you will ever experience as a woman. But I also think that they are some of the most rewarding because you enter into this whole new chapter where you become a mother and a professional, and having this duality in your persona is really fascinating, and it's a very challenging thing to navigate. But I found pregnancy and maternity and coming back to work full time to be one of the most challenging things I've ever done. Everything else feels pretty easy after that.
Yeah. I mean, yes, 100%. I also feel like we definitely need like at least 12 months of maternity leave. I don't understand how Europe has that and America has not caught up with that same sort of,
I agree,
mentality in the workforce.
I agree.
Because it's so necessary.
I agree. Yeah.
And then my second question is, what is a piece of advice that you would give for women who are entering the professional field and want to be in PR or marketing and communications?
Okay. I think I have so many feelings about this. One is I think um you need to be an avid consumer of media if you want to work in this space. So, understanding who the outlets are, understanding who's who, and kind of following these things and being really invested in following them is really, really important. By following them, you really learn like who's telling which stories, how are they telling them, who has a particular point of view. That's very interesting. So I think you need to be an avid consumer of media. That's for one thing. And then I think going back to that idea, I feel like I can't say this enough. It's like data and storytelling, data and storytelling. It's like never forget who your audience is. I think sometimes our actions can be really driven by our own personal biases, and it's really important to check your biases relative to like what you're trying to do, and make sure that you are telling the best story to the best target audience. And I think data and storytelling, never forget to marry those two. The other thing I think I'm a big believer in is internships, internships, internships. I think intern as much as you possibly can when you are in college, because it is the way to figure out what you want to do. I did an internship at Sotheby's, and that was how I figured out I will never work at an auction house.
Same for me with Christie's.
And it's just not for me.
Yeah.
And I worked there at the time of the Sotheby's Christie scandal. People were being fired left and right. And I remember one of my random tasks as an intern was getting a bunch of motorcycles, because this was when the Guggenheim had also done their motorcycle show, back to their owners. And I was like, I don't know how to ship motorcycles. And they would just like figure it out. And I was like, why am I shipping motorcycles as an intern? But that's what I was doing at the time. And so, internships are a really great way to figure out, well, what do you want to do? What do you not want to do? And to be able to do that while you're a student is really valuable, because even with marketing and communications, there's so many different expressions of it. I actually started out in development. And what I found was that the work that you're doing in development and the work that you're doing in marketing communications are very related. And in a lot of institutions, they report into the same person who might be like a head of external affairs. But the reason that I ultimately felt like development wasn't a long-term home for me was that in development, you're speaking to a very narrow audience. You're speaking to an affluent audience that has, a fiscal exchange with an institution. And I wanted to talk to a broad egalitarian audience. And that was sort of why I pivoted into marketing and communications, because I didn't want to be limited. But the work is very similar. It's about telling a compelling story about your institution to an audience and, hoping to either encourage them to donate or to visit, what have you. So, internships will help you out in figuring out, well, what is it actually that I am trying to do? And I think taking advantage of that in college is really valuable. So.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree with that, because I mean, when I got out of school and while I was in school, I was doing internships literally everywhere. So I think at this point have worked in every single sector in the art world in terms of like galleries, auction houses, museum, all that stuff, publications, and just to see where I fit in.
Yeah.
And what really worked for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to remember at different moments in your career, you will fit better into different places.
Yes. That's really important also, because the person you are at 21 is not the person you are in your 30s, 40s, or 50s.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, are you ready for the fire round of questions?
Yes, I am. Yes.
Okay, so I have 10 questions. I think we'll have enough time for like 2 or 3. You essentially get to pick a number, and then I read the corresponding question.
Okay. 6.
6. What is a piece of art that you own that you would never sell, or one that is your favorite?
I have a piece by Gerard and Kelly that is connected to timelining, which was an acquisition that we made when I was the co-chair of the Young Collectors Council at the Guggenheim. And that performance is always in my mind. And the sculptural piece that I have that's connected to the performance is something I think that I would never part with.
Okay, next.
Yes. Let's go with 2.
2. Name a book or film that had a profound influence in your life.
Oh my God. So many. Okay. I'm going to go back to my childhood. There is a novel that I read in 4th grade called From the Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Basil E. Frankweiler. And it's about a brother and a sister from Connecticut who run away from home and decide to live at the Metropolitan Museum of Art for a little bit. And I think that was the book that made me fall in love with museums and the idea of working in the art world.
That's so cute. I've never heard of that book until someone also mentioned it on my podcast on one of the episodes. And I was like, now I need to look into it.
And I had the pleasure of reading it to my kids a few years ago, and then they loved it. And I was like, oh, all these full circle moments.
Oh, and then they're going to read it to their kids. Oh, that's
I
so
hope
cute.
so. It's a really, really great book.
Okay, one more.
Number 9.
9. What do you always travel with?
Oh gosh. Okay. I travel a lot. Not as much anymore.
Okay.
I do still travel a lot. I would say like technical things like my laptop, like I never go anywhere without it. But I have some good luck pieces of jewelry. I'm a really big fan of costume jewelry, and I feel like
love your ring, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
It's incredible.
I feel like costume jewelry is my armor, and so I would say minus things like your laptop that you have to take everywhere. I feel like for me, it's always, I like to always travel with things and dress in ways that convey my personality no matter where I'm going. So I would say some of my favorite pieces of costume jewelry always come with me wherever I go.
That's a cute answer. Well, thank you so much for being
Thank
here.
you. This was really fun.
Yes,
Despite my cold and my cough, this was very fun.
No, this was a great conversation. I loved it. Thank you for sharing so much of your wisdom and knowledge and experience. I mean, you shared some real pearls of wisdom
Thank
that
you.
I'm sure will be helpful to a lot of people. So thank you.
Thank you.
And to all my listeners, thank you for joining us, and I'll see you guys next week. Bye.